David Brewster here with Brewster's Millions of Rants, and this is guitar notation. And I've had lots of students and friends and peers and ex-girlfriends and ex-band members and lots of just random people ask me over the years, should I learn how to read music? And my answer is always the same, yes, you should. And I'm sure there's people watching this that are, your arms are crossed and you're like, well, I read tab and I'm not going to learn how to read music, or I don't want to learn music theory. And there's this kind of aggressive stance about not learning more about music. And I've always been confused about that because when I was a teenager, I realized I didn't know anything about the guitar and about music, and I was learning, little bits and pieces of things. And then I would be around somebody that played piano, or maybe they were like in band and they played saxophone or something, and they were talking about notes and scales and modes and keys and key signatures and things. And I knew I didn't know what any of that stuff was. And instead of getting angry, I pushed myself. I was like, no, I want to learn what that is. I want to learn how to read music. I want to know the notes on the fretboard. I want to understand scales and chords and progressions and all this stuff. Now, before you pencil me down as some sort of, theory scholar, kind of music snob or whatever, that's not me. Because when I first started playing guitar, I had about 6 months of lessons. And then after that, I was on my own. I learned by ear. I learned out of guitar magazines and songbooks and things like that. But I was reading tablature. I didn't know how to read music. I didn't learn how to read music until I was about a junior in high school, and I started taking classical guitar lessons, because I wanted to, and I wanted to learn how to read music. I was also obsessed with Randy Rhoads and Yngwie, which that steered me toward classical guitar. But that's when I learned how to read, and that was a junior in high school. So since that time, I've gone to school, I've got a degree in music, I've been published, and I've been teaching, since I was in high school. I've been performing since I was about 15, professionally. So I've had a long career with music and the guitar, and I've met so many different types of people, self-taught ear, feel players. I've worked with, schooled, educated musicians, various styles of music, rock and jazz and classical and folk and country and all kinds of stuff. But at the end of the day, I can relate to both worlds. I can relate to the self-taught ear player, and I can also relate to the schooled, educated, theory type player, because I've kind of had, one foot in both of those worlds. And I don't know, I'm not saying that makes me special or anything like that, but I have had experience on both sides of that fence. And it does seem like there are a lot of guitarists that are just sitting on that fence, not really sure which way to go. But let me go ahead and say this on camera. Guitar tablature is extremely useful. It's endlessly valuable for a guitarist. And I don't know how many arguments and conversations I've had with people that played piano or maybe another instrument, and they looked at guitar tab like it was cheating or it wasn't real. And I highly disagree with that, and I argue with that. And basically, tablature has been around longer than standard notation, like note reading. And you have to think, like the lute appeared somewhere around like the 11th, 12th century, and lute tablature appeared, very long after that. Like I think it appeared around the 12th century. So as far as those early forms of tablature and notation, here's an image I made just showing some of those early kind of, sporadic variations of the way music was written before it was actually organized. And then here's an image featuring some lute tablature from the 1500s. And you have to imagine the lute appeared around the 11th century, lute tablature appeared around the 12th century. The guitar didn't appear until 1850-ish. There were early versions and variations of the guitar. But what we think of as the guitar today really didn't appear until around 1850, somewhere around there. And I'm not talking about the electric guitar, I'm talking the acoustic guitar. Electric guitar didn't appear until the 1930s. But around 1850, that's when, what we think of as the guitar actually appeared. So music notation and, lute tablature and things like that have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. You got to think the harpsichord, the piano, the violin, the viola and everything. They had hundreds and hundreds of years to use notation to kind of flesh and organize, that material. And by the time the guitar actually appeared, it still wasn't in concert houses. It wasn't, playing with symphonic orchestras or anything like that. The guitar was a gypsy instrument. Beggars in the street play guitar. People, invited friends and family over to their house and they would entertain their guests with the guitar. It wasn't a concert instrument at that time. So even the early years of the guitar was very kind of sketchy and very, it was thought of as a toy. And, here's an image I made just showing some images of the early years of the guitar. And you have to think that's where it started. And here's an image, showing some early lute tablature, which if you look at it carefully from what you can see it does appear similar to guitar tablature that a lot of you, I'm sure, use every day when you play guitar. Historically, the guitar literally had to catch up to other instruments, violin, piano, brass and woodwind instruments, and other instruments that were already established and on the scene for hundreds of years before 1850. So the guitar, unfortunately, had to catch up. And if you've ever tried to learn standard notation, it's very hard on a guitar. And I'll argue with anybody, whether they're a theory scholar or a piano player or whoever, because usually the people that point at tablature and they don't really understand, what a guitarist is doing when they read tablature, they just basically don't understand the instrument. They think this is a piano, or they think this is, a saxophone. It's just different, wood with strings, but it's the same thing, right? No, it's not. It's completely different. Now, standard notation makes perfect sense for the piano. All the notes are laid out in front of you, white and black. They only appear once, per octave. You don't have multiple repeats of the same notes in different octaves, which is what you have on the guitar. So the biggest difficulty area for reading standard notation on the guitar is the way the guitar is tuned and the way the notes basically fall on the fretboard. Now, on a piano or a brass or woodwind instrument, xylophone, whatever, the notes only happen or occur once. You blow into the horn and you create this pitch, and there's middle C or A or whatever note you're hitting. Same thing on a piano, middle C or a different note somewhere on the keyboard, but it only happens or occurs once. On the guitar, say, the top space on the notational staff, the note E, I can play that E here, here, here. You can even bend up to it, from the 22nd fret right there. So there's, 6 different places I can play that same note. So that definitely, if you see that one note written on the staff, that's going to slow your progress, sight reading or playing through that, because you have to quickly decide, where am I going to play that note? And then if that note is followed by another note, then you have to quickly decide where it is too, because that situation happens all over the fretboard. As far as reading guitar notation, I personally feel that every guitarist watching this should know how to read every form of guitar notation: chord diagram, fretboard diagram, tablature, and standard notation, and the various other little forms of notation that exist. But those 4 forms right there are the most common. You're going to see them in books and magazines, online, and you definitely should be familiar with all 4 versions: chord and fretboard diagrams, tablature, and standard notation. If you're only speaking to other guitarists, then I guess you can kind of have tab talk or whatever. But the moment you start talking to a violinist or another musician that plays an instrument that isn't the guitar, especially a piano player, there's a gap, because the main problem with tablature that I have, that most people should have, is it forces you to think of fret numbers instead of notes, right? Most people would think of that as a 5 right there, the 5th fret on the A string, instead of thinking that as the note D, which is what note that is. So if you started, talking to a violinist or a bassoon player or whoever, and they asked, hey, what note are you playing right there? If you said the 5th fret or 5, they would laugh at you. They'd be like, well, what note is it? And if you couldn't tell them, then that's kind of showing a little bit of your ignorance, because no offense, you should know the notes on the fretboard, you should know, front and back, every string cold. Like if I point into this and say, well, what note is that? You should know what that is. That's just basically the octave of the D that I was holding down back here. But you should know the notes on the fretboard, every string, every location. And that's something that I think everybody should do. Once you have that under your belt, then you're basically associating those notes on the fretboard with the dots that you see on the staff. And for most of the tab readers, you think of those notes as numbers. But once you kind of flip that in your head and get away from thinking of numbers and you start thinking of notes, you can associate those little dots with actual note names. You should do some note searches and just basically select a note and then start finding it on the guitar and then associate that and find it on the staff and compare and notice, okay, this note looks like that when it's written in standard notation. So to get started here, I'm just going to use the open strings and we're going to start with E. And we're just going to basically find E from low E string open up to about the 12th fret there on the high E string. And the lowest note you can write on the staff is this low E, and then an octave higher, and then an octave higher, which is going to put you in that top space on the staff, and then another E way up on ledger lines there. So let's do that again with A and also with D. So they open A string, and then A there on the 2nd fret on the G, A on the 5th fret there on the high E string, and then way up on the 17th fret on the high E. And you can also do it with D too. The open D string, and then the 3rd fret there on the B string is the note D, an octave higher there, 10th fret there on the high E string, the 22nd fret way up on the high E string. The next open string would be G, so we can find a G right here, that lower octave, and then that middle octave you could play the open G string, or you could also play the 5th fret there on the D, same note. The next G would be an octave higher here, and that's creeping up above the staff right there, just right above that top line. And then you go all the way up to the 15th fret there on the high E string, there's a higher G. And then finally the open B string. So the important thing here is I'm literally just targeting the open strings and then I'm fleshing those open string notes out in octaves along the fretboard. But the most important thing, aside from that, is looking at the way those notes look on the staff. So really notice, as the E moves to A, moves to D, moves to G, moves to B, look at the changes and where those notes are moving. Once you've done that with all the open strings, then you basically can kind of flesh out open position right here from the open strings to about the 4th or 5th fret, depending on how far you want to go up. So for this exercise, once again, when I flash the notation at the end, pause the screen and look at, the notation. Don't just look at the tab. Look above the tab and look for those note heads and what's happening. Because here we're going to start with the low E string open. The lowest note you can play without tuning, lower, like to drop D. But there's the lowest note with ledger lines on the guitar. And then we're going to walk up to F, F sharp, G, G sharp, and then A. When we hit that A note, we can move to the next string. And now we're going to basically start with the same note and then just move up chromatically. A sharp, B, C, C sharp to D. And then do it again. There was the open D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, and G. Now on the G string, we're going to stop right here on the 4th fret on that B note, mainly because the next string is B. So there was the open G, G sharp, A sharp, and B. Then the next string, we have the open B, C, C sharp, D, D sharp, and E. And then finally the high E string mimics and mirrors the low E string, so there was E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, and A. Now, I didn't want to show you this as an exercise. You can sit there and play that if you want to. That's not really what we're worried about. We're worried about what that looks like on paper, and that's what this image is going to show you. As far as what I just walked through, that's not a complete, how to read music on guitar, course or something. I'm just literally sticking your toes in that pool, just kind of getting you thinking about notes and what it looks like on the staff and where you might find it on the fretboard. You can compare that to what it looks like on tablature, and you can start getting those gears turning a little bit. The other thing I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to give props to Guitar Tablature, which I'm guessing some of you probably thought I wasn't going to boost or boast about using Tab. I use Guitar Tablature every day. I write things out using Guitar Tablature every day. Here's my cheat sheet for this lesson. If you look carefully, you can see I wrote the entire chart using tablature. I didn't write anything in standard notation. Now, some of you watching this might be thinking, well, why are you writing everything out in tablature? You know, cheater, or are you too lazy to write it out in standard notation? I mean, basically, I use tablature. It's like shorthand or something, you know, like almost like a little quick code that I can write down. If I wanted to write that out using standard notation, it would have taken me like twice as long. And you know, writing all the notes and trying to get the spacing and everything where it's legible to read. I can jot down with a pen, you know, something written in tablature and see it from across the room. But with standard notation, it takes me a little bit longer. So even though I can read and I'm fluent, for me to like sight read something, I prefer to actually have the guitar transcription where I have standard notation and tablature together because I use them at the same time. And the notation helps because it gives me the rhythm, gives me the contour, you know, is what I'm playing going up or is it going down? There's a lot of information that helps you see what you're supposed to do when you're reading standard notation. And the big plus for tablature that standard notation doesn't really give you, I mean, it can, but it's just adding more and more little notation and symbols. But it's the fingering, it's the position, like where am I putting what I'm playing? Notation helps you see like the rhythm and the flow, but tablature helps you hone in on where you're supposed to play it. And this is, you know, an area that I wanted to kind of show too, where let's say you had the C major scale written in standard notation, all right, C major. You could physically play that, you know, 6 different places like this. You know, there's open position C right there. Go up a little bit higher and fret everything. 3 notes per string. So right there, I just said C major scale, and I just uncovered 6 different places you can play that. That doesn't happen on piano. That doesn't happen on a trumpet or a saxophone or whatever. That only really happens on string fretted instruments where you have this overlap, you know, in different notes kind of relocate in a different position, but it's the same pitch, the same octave, just on a different string. So that is the red light or the stop sign for reading, you know, standard notation. That is what makes it so hard because you have to constantly think. You have to think 2 or 3 times as hard as someone playing piano or another instrument simply because they don't have the situations and hurdles that you have on the fretboard. While this rant video didn't really have shredding licks or anything crazy, what I'm talking about and what we just kind of ran through is very important. And there's this crossroad that it seems every guitarist, you know, comes across where they have to choose, you know, choose your own adventure. Are you going to read, you know, music or you're not going to read music? Are you going to read tablature or not read tablature? Are you going to do this or do that? And you constantly have to make those decisions. You know, am I going to play a flying V or am I not going to play a flying V or whatever? But with notation, I feel it's important. Yes, it's hard. It's like learning an entirely new language, you know, to read it and write it and understand it. It really is. I mean, music is a language. But, you know, learning standard notation, learning theory, learning how to read and write music, that's a process. That's going to take years of dedication. You know, it's not something you're just going to pick up on a weekend or, you know, in a month or something like that. You know, it's really something you're going to have to kind of study and memorize and come back to it and strengthen your ability and come back to it. And it's something you're literally kind of grow the ability. And I think for a lot of people, they just think, well, I don't need it, you know, but, you know, if you're just so naturally gifted where you just pick up the guitar and it's effortless and you can play whatever you hear in your head, you know, you can flawlessly learn things, you know, by ear. You know, you never have to look at transcriptions. You never have to buy books or anything like that or magazines. You know, if you literally just blowing through music and the guitar with no problem. If that's you, then maybe you don't need it. You know, maybe you are that naturally gifted and you're like a Paganini or Mozart or whatever, and you're just that naturally gifted. I wasn't that naturally gifted. I'll tell you, when I first started playing guitar, I was horrible. I had a horrible sense of rhythm. I couldn't really read. I barely had any knowledge. But I slowly started to kind of organize or assemble, my education. And I knew what the prize was. I knew, when I started looking up and thinking, okay, I want to learn how to read music. I want to learn music theory. I want to learn this and that. I pushed myself and made myself go that way. And it was hard, but looking back, I'm so glad that I did that because it's like, wow, I'm glad I didn't skip anything. I'm glad that I, kind of dove into some of that easy stuff because now I look back and think, wow, I'm actually using, some of that easy stuff. All right, that's going to wrap this rant video. And like I said, I know I didn't show any flashy licks or any shredding, but there's more to learning music in the guitar than flashy licks and shredding. There's a lot more, and that's kind of why I wanted to put this video out there because I've had so many people ask, worried and concerned parents or worried or concerned students or whoever, and there's this big question mark and question about tablature. Is it real? Is it an accepted form of reading music on guitar? Yes, reading guitar tablature is now, it's an accepted form. Maybe like 50 or 100 years ago, people didn't really know, what they were doing with it, but by this point in time, with the internet and guitar magazines, instructional material, guitar tablature is everywhere. It's harder now to find guitar music not written in tablature than it is with tablature. So it's accepted and it's widely available. But I still feel that reading music is essential. It's important. It's the language of music. It's the written language of music. So that's really important. You don't have to be a sight reading master or anything, but you at least need to know the basics. Keys and key signatures, rhythms, noticing contour and pitch. And just, once you start kind of getting your feet wet and you start reading at least that much, I have a feeling that you're going to be motivated and maybe start reading a little bit more. Maybe you'll get a little more curious, or you'll start, maybe taking a online class, or you read a book or something. All right, that's going to wrap this episode of Brewster's Millions of Rants with guitar notation. Please leave some feedback and some comments and subscribe to Late Night Lessons, and I'll be back before you know it with more content and material. Thank you.